underdogs. They're the unlikely heroes, counted out, given no chance to win. But the playbook flips when God's involved. That's how shepherds take down giants. You see, when God steps in, the odds change. The weak become strong, the meek become mighty, and the lowly become legends.
Morning. There's times when it's like, when the worship team is, man, they do songs that you're like, they just speak to you, right? That was one of those. That's one of those where I feel like we don't need a message now, right? Like, I'm just gonna pray and we're all gonna go to lunch. Does that sound good? There's a lot of you that were excited about that. Okay, don't worry, I'll speed this thing up. Don't worry, no, it's good. Hey, if you want to pray for the sermon today, I'll just say this: pray for coherence. We went to Ohio the last few days. We got to this really cool thing where we celebrated my dad's 80th birthday yesterday. But that also meant that I was in Dayton, Ohio yesterday at about 4 o'clock. And that means I was here about 1 o'clock this morning. So we're still waking up. This is coffee number double digits, I'm pretty sure. And no, I was kidding. No, we're gonna have some fun today. But I just gotta tell you, it was such a cool time. It was kind of turned into like a mini family reunion. We saw a family I hadn't seen in years. And it's cool to get together and commune and just talk and share stories, reminisce. We got to celebrate people that we had lost along the way, and of course celebrate my dad, who is just one of the biggest caregivers I've ever met. And so it was just so fun to be there and celebrate him. And it's also it's great to be here with you guys. And so I'm glad we made it back, and I'm glad we woke up for the morning, which is good. And so we're gonna finish off our Underdog series today, which, just so you know, challenge accepted. I'm gonna try to use the word underdog as many times as I can in the next 15 minutes, because this is the last chance we have to do it. But here's the question I have for you as we get started. We're gonna talk about David in just a minute, but have you ever made a mess of a situation? Okay, there's a lot of laughs. You guys are already. Now, I'm not talking about the type of mess where you like fall down your white carpeted stairs with a cup of coffee, which I have done. But I'm talking about where your actions, whatever the choice you made a whole lot of people around you kind of angry and mad at you. And maybe people were hurt in the situation. Maybe have you ever done that? Give me a show of hands. I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. But I can tell you this: I have. I know that's surprising, but plenty of times. I was a youth pastor for 20 years, and I feel like in youth ministry, there's lots of opportunities to do this and lots of opportunities to kind of mess things up. But there was one specific one that came to mind as I was thinking about this. Is we were running this camp in Singapore, and we had to kind of plan everything because you didn't have like bigger retreat centers, or, like you didn't have larger organizations. Like, here we have like Challenge, where 5,000 students can go, and it's one big conference that youth groups can take everybody to, or Impact, or Hidden Acres and what they do, which is, there's tons of fun things a youth group can take their students to. Well, in Asia, we didn't have very many of those, so we had to plan them. So we got really full. We kind of went hard after these. We kind of created these big camp and big retreat experiences. We were having a ton of fun, but there was this one that I felt like we couldn't catch a break on. And we had planned it, we were excited, and we were organizing it, we were getting everything ready, and then all of a sudden, we used to bring in like worship teams from overseas and speakers from overseas. Well, the speaker who came in, he had a hard time kind of connecting with students, and then the worship team that came in, we had them come in before, and they were amazing. But then this time, it's like they landed, and there was all this infighting among the team. So the whole time it was like this ego trip kind of shared on this team. So they were struggling to like lead. At one point, they just kept turning the music up louder. And there's an issue when you have a room full of high school and middle school students and they think the music is too loud. Like that, you have an issue then, I feel like. And so that was a struggle. And then the place that we went to, we rented out this retreat center, had all the fun stuff, the high ropes courses, all the experiential stuff. But then we got there and it was too late to leave. And this place was like, it wasn't even hygienic. It was dirty, it was gross, kids got lice. And so, yeah, it was bad. All of you just started doing this. That's really funny. Like there was like 4 people immediately scratched their head when I said that. Okay, yeah, it was horrible. It was like We just road tripped back from Ohio, right? It's like, you know that road trip bathroom that you want to spend the least amount of time in possible? It was that, but you lived there all weekend long. It was rough. So we got home, and now the cool thing is God still did some cool stuff, but as the leader of this thing, I had a lot of people unhappy. Have you ever been in a situation where because of your choices, because of your actions, you had people unhappy? I'm getting a lot of nods right now. Like, there's a lot of people that's, yeah. So David, who we're gonna talk about today, this is where he finds himself. He finds himself in a situation where his choices have created a situation where his closest people are angry with him. He has about 600 guys that he has formed this little army with. They have been battling together for the last couple years. So you know they're close and they're angry with him. And I don't know about you, but I would not like 600 soldiers mad at me at the same time. But let's see what situation he gets himself into. So David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Oh, sorry, I didn't really give you a heads up on this one. We're in 1 Samuel 30. My bad. And then if you want to follow along, we're on page 238 and the Bible's in the chairs. Sorry about that. I was just diving right in. I'm excited to talk about this. While you're doing this, I know some people are getting fine. I will give you a little bit of context here. So David he's on the run. He's not king yet. Saul is after him. He has formed this little army, and what he's decided to do is kind of leave Israel for a little bit. He's tried to get away, kind of get a respite away from, the whole being hunted down to death thing. And so he's away. He's actually made this really interesting partnership with an enemy king. So he's been fighting for them, and he's kind of been telling everybody that he's fighting Israel even though he isn't. And so he's gotten himself in this interesting situation that, again, you guys know I like to nerd out on this stuff. The author of 1 Samuel has done an amazing job writing this story that when you read 1 Samuel all in one sitting and you see the story play out, there's this tension being built where the author is almost trying to tell you and maybe point you to the fact that David might be the one that's going to kill Saul because Saul just found out he's going to die. And so what's interesting, if you read the last 10 chapters of 1 Samuel, you're going to see this tension kind of grow because the author is doing a great job building it. Now, instead, that doesn't happen. David gets sent back home. So they've been away. They were going to go to battle, and now they're being sent home. But what happens when they get home is not the best circumstances. So David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, so Ziklag is where they're staying. It's a cool city name. And so when they come home, this is what they find. They found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. So can you imagine being in a place to where your choices, your leadership, your actions now has brought everybody home and they have lost everything? Their houses are burned down, where they're staying is gone, and all of their possessions, including their families. That was a weird way to say it. Their families and then their possessions, sorry, let me put that in right order, are all gone. Could you imagine that? You have 600 soldiers, and this is what it says. Their response is that they wept until they could not weep anymore. Did you catch that? That's some level of emotion, right? I mean, that's how we are as Midwesterners, right? We act like that all the time. I'm just kidding, sorry. We usually are pretty toned down, but can you imagine the level of emotion that goes into this when they turn the corner and they realize their city has been burned down and everything is gone? And did you catch their response to David? David was greatly distressed, which I wonder what that looked like for him to be distressed. But the reason they were distressed was because the men were talking of stoning him. you have 600 soldiers that at the same time all hate you. How would you respond to that? When somebody's mad at you, how do you normally respond? I don't know, if you're like me, like there's a whole series of possible like responses, right? Blame shifting, denial, excuses, right? Trying to avoid it. Is anybody else? I've done all of those. Anybody else? Like, could you imagine like all of this happening at once? But here's the thing that I want to lean into. This is the phrase that I want to get to, is this: but David found strength in the Lord his God. What's interesting to me is that the author of Samuel, the narrator who's telling us this story, doesn't tell us anything else. He doesn't tell us what that looks like. He doesn't tell us what David did. He doesn't tell us how he did it. He just said David found strength in the Lord his God. Another word for that is he found courage in the Lord his God. And there's a part of me that I wish so much that the author would give us one more phrase. How? Now, we have some ideas on how he did it. We know David pretty well. If you know David, he was a really, really like strong fighter. He was a mighty warrior, but he was also a songwriter. I don't know if you knew that part, but he was a big journaler, right? And so he would go and he would kind of like take time and he would write songs. And a lot of his songs were all about how hard life was, and yet how God can meet him in the difficulty. Let me give you an example. This is one of his songs. Psalm 27 says this. This is just the first little bit of the psalm. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my stronghold and my love. Back up. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble, he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent and set me high upon a rock. Then my head will be exalted above the enemies who surround me. At his sacred tent I will sacrifice with shouts of joy. I will sing and make music to the Lord. Hear my voice when I call, Lord. Be merciful to me and answer me. My heart says of you, seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek. In the book of Psalms, we have 150 psalms that are mostly all songs that were written to God. Most of those are all lament psalms, which means they start in sadness, they start in pain, they start in heartache, and every single one of them are a reminder of who God is and how God can work mighty. And of those 150, 73 of them David wrote. So if I had to guess, David probably strengthened himself in the Lord his God by writing. My guess is he got away and he journaled for a little bit. This whole series has been about underdogs and about being the ones who maybe are in the rough spot or in the rough place right now. And this is another chance where David is the underdog. And I think as we close up this series, every single one of us at times are going to face a decision moment. We're going to be in such a situation where we either have to choose to get out and leave and be done, or press in and maybe stay true to something. There's a version of this story where you could see David walking away from it right then and there, couldn't you? David, who was basically already anointed king, he knew he was going to be the leader of Israel. Could you imagine him coming to this situation, seeing everything, losing his own family, knowing that the whole army had lost their whole families? Could you see the response for just a moment being, "It's all right, I'm out. I'm done. Just take me now." Could you see that response? Would any of you kind of be in that place where you're like, "I think I'm out. I think I'm done. This has been too hard. This is too painful"? David faces a decision, and his decision is this: I'm going to strengthen myself in the Lord my God. And while we don't know what that looks like, my question still for us today is, where does your strength come from? When life gets hard, when questions swirl in your head, when stress or distress hits, when depression sinks in deep, when life kind of feels hopeless for a little bit, where does your strength come from? Because for David, I can't imagine too many rough scenarios where he hits. And in the middle of this, he's our example. Because the example for us is he's going to go strengthen himself in his God. So why can't you and I do the exact same thing? You know, in the book of 1 Samuel, David is the example. David and Saul, the original king, who is actually king right now in this story, he actually is going to pass away in his next chapter. But Saul and David are put together as comparisons to each other. Saul is the first king that Israel wanted. David is the real king that Israel needed. And David is about to become king in the next few chapters in this 2 Samuel. But the whole book of 1 Samuel tells us the story of Saul, who is an example to you and I. Saul becomes the warning light on the dashboard when we have to change our oil. We have to pay attention to something that's wrong. Saul is the example for you and I. When we read about Saul, the question for us is, hey, are you willing to deal with your dark side? Are you willing to deal with the stuff in you that you might not want to address or look at or even think about? Because if you don't, you might end in a worse place than you'd like. David becomes the example for you and I. And the author of Samuel is very clear to tell the story that way. Saul is the example that we need warned. We have to pay attention to what's going on in our hearts and our minds and our relationship with God. And if we don't, we could end up in some bad places. David becomes this amazing example because he becomes the example of what it means to be hopeful and confident in God working, not his own power and strength. And it's that way throughout the whole book. Here's my question for us today. Is, do we act like David, or do we look a lot more like Saul? Because Saul relies on himself. Saul relies on his own strength. Saul relies on his way of doing things. David realizes he's the underdog and lets God lead and lets God work and lets God move. David is the one that teaches you and I that it's a relationship with God we have to continue digging into. At any given time, who do you and I look more like? Do we look more like Saul, or do we look more like David? But there's another question that comes up for me. When the author tells us that David found strength in the Lord his God, there's a part of me that's like, I wonder how he did it. We talked about the journaling idea. David was really good at that. But aren't there other ways to find strength in God? Aren't there ways, see, here's what I think is I think David was teaching us something. I think David was teaching us that he knew where to go to find the next right step. He knew that God would meet him exactly where he was in the pain and the hurt and the heartache, and that God would help him do the next right thing. I think that's the example for us. Now, what we can also take from that is that the God of the universe, who pursues us and who wants to be in relationship with us and who knows us better than we know ourselves, there we go. He wants to meet with us, and we can meet with him in a variety of ways. So do I think that David found strength in the Lord by prayer? Probably, because I think that's a powerful way to meet with God. Do I think that David found strength in the Lord through Scripture? Yeah. I think that's an incredible baseline of understanding who God is, understanding who he is and what he's doing and how to follow him. But do I think that there's other ways to meet with God? Absolutely. Did you know that for some people, walking outside is one of the best places to meet with God? That being outside in nature for them is one of the clearest ways that they can meet with God. I'm thinking of my wife right now, Katie. God speaks to her outside. If she has a question, if she is struggling, if she wants to find strength in the Lord, that's where Katie goes. She's going to go on a walk, and I guarantee you she's going to hear from God. For me, it's different. For me, I wish I could say this. I wish I could say I was an artist, because I would love. There's some people who meet with God through art, maybe by creating art or appreciating art, sometimes by drawing. There's a whole different ways to create. Sometimes it's painting, drawing. There's some people who just meet with God that way. I've been in places where people listen to sermons by drawing out their notes and making pictures, and it is one of the most beautiful things in the world. I wish I could do it. I'm jealous of those, but that's how they meet with God. There's some that love music. For some, it's writing music. For some, it's listening. For some, it's just putting that right song on at the right time, and that's the space where they find strength in the Lord. I'm giving you these examples because here's the thing. I think the God who knows us the way he does, knows that we can meet with him in different ways. And I think sometimes it's realizing, how do we meet with God? And if we don't, then maybe it's worth trying some new things. I'll tell you, for me, it's always been people. I'm kind of an extreme extrovert. I love people all the time. And so for me, it's sitting with people, being in conversation, asking great questions, laughing, playing games. We're a huge board game family, and so I love playing games. And for me, that's when God meets with me. Actually, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was sitting talking with a cousin, and he works in Cincinnati. He actually trains a lot of, he's an older guy now. He's kind of getting towards retirement, and he's training a lot of younger professionals. And he said something yesterday, and it was funny because he said it, and he was just kind of sharing some wisdom with me, and I immediately was like, I needed that for the message tomorrow. I'll be honest. You just totally spoke something in a different way that I'd never heard of it said this way. And he said, so he trains people in the business world. He's actually an attorney, and he trains a lot of younger attorneys. And he said this, he's like, John, what's funny is a lot of people will say, you've got to be in the right place at the right time to get the right client, to get the right deal, to find fortune, to get success. He was like, it seems like that's kind of the mantra, right place at the right time. Have you heard of that before? People are looking to be in the right place at the right time. And he's like, what's funny is I don't think that's fully true. And I was like, really? And he was like, what do you think? He was like, I think it's all about being in the right place many times over and over. And if you find yourself in the right place many times over and over and over, the right time is going to happen. You keep putting yourself in the right place. And that whole time he was saying that, I was like, that's exactly what David does. That's David's example for you and I. He knew where the right place was. He knew that the right place was meeting with his God. He knew that the right place was finding strength in his Lord. And what's interesting here is David just didn't do it David doesn't come home to Ziklag and see his city burned and say, now it's time to go meet with God. David had been meeting with God so much regularly, for so long, that this was just a natural step for him. God, I don't know what to do. I am in the pain of all pain. My heart is broken. I cannot physically weep anymore. What do I do? And so it wasn't when time is hard, go find God. What David was doing exactly what he does all the time. I meet with God regularly. This situation's hard, so I'm going to do exactly what I know to do because God's going to meet me in that space. Here's my question for us. Is that what we do? Do you and I do the same thing? Do we find our strength in the Lord? John Mark Comer has this book called Practicing the Way. It's all about spiritual formation and what it means to be in a relationship with God. And he says something that really got my attention. I think Jeremy actually shared this book a couple weeks ago. I think we have it in the bookstore. There might only be one copy left, so after this, if you want to, it's on Amazon, you can get it. What's really neat is we're going to be doing a class on practicing the way later this fall. It starts in late September. You're going to hear more about that. But it goes into this idea of what does it mean to walk with God regularly? What does it mean to follow him? And he has this statistic in the book that I was like, oh, NorthPoint, we need to challenge ourselves with this. He says that in America right now, 63% of Americans will say that they are Christian, but only 4% will say that they follow Jesus. 63% will basically say, yes, culturally, I identify as a Christian. I believed in Jesus. I think he did what he said he did. He resurrected, and I have prayed a prayer, and I have decided to follow him. But only 4% actually see their life with Jesus as a regular thing, where they're living it out, where they're apprenticing with Jesus. I think David is showing us what it looks like to walk with God regularly. And so NorthPoint, is that what we do? Are we in such a place to where we make a priority to meet with God so that when life is hard or we have the questions or we struggle, we know exactly where we can go to? And do we know how we can do it? For so long, I think people have said you can only meet with God in certain ways, and I think there's a variety because God, the ultimate creator, the most creative being that in existence, knows how to meet with us. So if I was to ask you a question, let me ask you this. Maybe if I can leave you with 3 questions, these are them. 1 is this one: where does your strength come from? But 2, do we make space to meet with God regularly? Is that something that we do? Maybe it's in prayer, maybe it's in reading scripture, and maybe it's in some other way as well. A challenging one for me, and it's something I've been kind of challenged with again lately, is in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is giving his most famous sermon, he actually has this comment. He says, when you fast. It wasn't if you fast. It's not when you think about fasting. It's when you fast. And then he goes on to teach about it. But let's just pause on that. When's the last time we have made so much space for God that we have fasted from things that we need in order to make space for God to speak to us? When's the last time we have skipped a meal to create space for God to speak? So do we meet with God regularly? And if not, how can we do that? Because I think sometimes it's not about time. Every single one of us can say how busy we are, and I get it, we are very busy. But right now it becomes priority, right? That's the question. Is God priority in our life? I have a feeling deep down, I think God speaks all the time. I think God is speaking all the time. Yet I know a lot of people who would say, God never speaks to me. I think there's a different question there. I think the question is are we listening? Are we creating space to get quiet enough for God to speak, for us to hear? Is that what we're giving him space to do? Are we leaning into God in such a way that we are letting him be our strength versus going and doing everything on our own and only coming to God when it's hard? Because I think David's experience is a whole lot different. David is regularly finding strength in God. And when times are hard, he just doubles down and does what he's always been doing. So the last one I'll just ask, this is the 3rd question I had just kind of written down, is right now, like, what gets in the way of your relationship with God? Is it time? Is it priority? Is it because we have so many other things on our list to do that we just don't get to it? What if we change that? And hear me on this. I'm not saying to go and spend 3 hours in prayer this week. I know people that do that. I am not one of them. I wish I was, because I think that would be amazing. And I know how powerful prayer is. But let me ask you this. If 30 minutes of prayer sounds too long for you, what if you gave it 20? If 20 sounds too long for you, what if this week, every day this week, you spent a little bit longer in either prayer or in scripture or in some way connecting with God than you did last week? And said, God, I'm gonna lean into making you a priority. I just wonder if all of a sudden you and I would hear God moving and see God in our lives a lot more than we did last week. I wonder if you and I might hear from God a little bit more than we have in the past few weeks. Because instead of prioritizing everything else, we start making space for the relationship with our God, which more than likely, a high majority of us in here would say would be priority in our lives. That's why we're here right now. I just think sometimes we get so busy we forget. So, let's be underdogs. Let's lean into the fact that you and I need. Let's lean into the fact that we don't have all the answers or all the strength. And let's find our strength in God. Let's get to the point to where God becomes so much of a relationship that we have that we begin hearing his voice a lot more than we did last week. I've often said I think this whole life thing is all about learning what love is. And so this week, let's learn a little bit more of how much God loves us by spending a little bit more time with him. Does that sound good? Is that something worth trying?